Walter, for that generous introduction, as always. So I must admit that I'm using all of you as a kind of pre-audience for a conference paper I have to give next week. And so I'd like to keep this as sort of casual and informal as I can. And I'm also kind of stepping beyond my dissertation here into beginning to consider how my work on Soviet television can also help contribute to understanding of television as a whole in other places, and media in general in other times before and after the kind of main television era, which now appears possibly to be ending. My dissertation is much more within the sort of bounds of Soviet history, helping to explain the collapse of the Soviet Union and the way that mass media contributed to that collapse or prefigured it in various ways. But today I'd like to talk more broadly about sort of how the question of how Soviet television kind of fits into or can contribute to our understanding of television as a medium and the processes of sort of change, the way media relate to one another and change over time. And more generally, the larger question that's always at hand when you're a historian of Russia of how the Russian and Soviet cases fit into European history or sort of broader Western history more generally or don't. So some of you have read a pre-circulated reading for today, but many of you have not. So I'm going to kind of briefly summarize that selection, kind of locate it within my larger project, and then speculate a little bit on the kind of topic of today's talk, which is how this kind of story of Soviet television, the ways that it adapted kind of ideas and forms from avant-garde Soviet cinema of the 1920s and 30s, what that may tell us about current digital media, which is part of the panel that I seem to have found myself on next week, and also just in general these larger questions about kind of where Russian media fit in with media elsewhere. Also, I'm getting over bronchitis, so I apologize if I sort of begin to hack at any point during this. So the selection that some of you read is from the first chapter of my dissertation that looks at the emergence on Soviet television in the 50s and 60s of a particular view of television as a medium. So anytime you have a television system, any kind of state or corporate entity, right, you have to decide a variety of things about it. You know, what is the medium, what is its nature, and then how are you going to use it, what is it for, and then also how are you going to kind of learn about your audience and respond to that demand. That's my second chapter. But here I look at how Soviet television workers, sort of small group, before the medium was a mass medium in the Soviet Union. This is from the 50s and 60s. There were about 1 million television sets in the Soviet Union in 1957, for example. So it's not a mass medium, it's just in major cities. How the sort of small group of television workers, who were themselves mostly, they describe themselves in retrospect as kind of dilettantes. They didn't fit into larger, they had not been successful in other more traditional artistic careers, so many of them were dropouts from the cinema or from theater. They had theatrical or cinematic education. Some of them were from radio and journalism. But all of them saw, they were very young for the most part, and many of them saw them as themselves as sort of misfits. How this group of people began to articulate in this particular time and place what television was as a medium, what it was like, and then therefore, in relation to that question, what it was for, how they should use it. So this particular view of television's nature emerged during this period, and it was focused on two things. The first, as those of you who read the reading saw, was liveness and immediacy. So the idea that television, because it was live, would focus on, would be able to reveal certain things about everyday life. So there was this idea that the television would be unpredictable, that you would watch it as reality unfolded before your eyes, and that this experience of watching this live, unmediated footage, basically, of everyday life, even the streets of Moscow, or particular events, would kind of engage viewers in this transformative experience, right? Very deeply engage them. They would be able to see, through a new form of kind of penetrating vision, into the nature of everyday life. The things which cloud our vision would be stripped away, and they would have a more clear view of Soviet reality. So this is one kind of node of this particular view of television's nature as a medium. And the other was the same kind of what was called new vision, and again, this is an idea from the 1920s and 30s in particular, of how this kind of new vision would allow you to look into, in particular, model individuals. And that comes slightly later, and to some extent is a response, as those of you who read the reading saw, to the experience of actually showing live, lived reality and sort of everyday life on television and the many dangers that that created in an environment of intense censorship that was not as strong as it would be, but nonetheless was still a significant factor in the late 50s in the Soviet Union. So the ability to actually show unmediated, unscripted everyday life as these kind of visionary television workers imagined was, as you might imagine, highly problematic. What if someone walked down the street wearing the wrong kind of sort of rebellious clothing or other kinds of things? So this focus on liveness and unscriptedness and unpredictability on the one hand, and on sort of new vision into either everyday life or particular model people, emerged in this period in a couple of different contexts. The first context that's important for understanding this is what's happening in the Soviet Union in this period. So the Soviet television begins to kind of, these new television workers, there's a big hiring wave, there's a bunch of new people coming in. In the mid-1950s, it really gets going in the late 1950s. And this is the period of reform in the Soviet Union known as Khrushchev's thaw. So this is a time when, among other things, as many of you may know, Khrushchev in 1956 criticizes Stalin, causing him, sort of opening up these new possibilities of critiquing the Soviet state and society as it had existed to this point, and kind of using the media in particular to do the work of de-Stalinization, to kind of strip away that which was corrupt and wrong, to undo the cult of personality by focusing on many new, unique individuals who were not Stalin or the leader, but sort of model regular people who would reveal the socialist transformation of everyday life. So this group of television workers very much saw themselves as actively engaged in doing the work of de-Stalinization. So they were encouraged by Khrushchev, as were other artistic and intellectual figures, to sort of go ahead and pursue these objectives of de-Stalinizing Soviet society. And at the same time, this was also a way for them to kind of write themselves into the artistic elite, which had various institutional bases that were desirable, right? There were artistic unions in the Soviet Union that gave you access to particular benefits. So the ability to kind of frame their work as doing this political de-Stalinizing work and also as becoming potentially an art form allowed them to kind of create career status for themselves. And sort of imagine themselves, turn themselves into artists and raise their own status as sort of, again, dilettantes in their early 20s. So that's one context for this emergence of these ideas about television's power to de-Stalinize. The second was their sort of theatrical and cinematic educations, right? These people had been trained as artists in a certain way, and so they drew, because of that training, they drew on their knowledge of the cinematic and theatrical avant-garde. And there were sort of three major concepts that they borrowed from both early Soviet theater and Soviet cinema. The first was one that I've mentioned already, which is New Vision, the idea of this penetrating revolutionary kind of site where you would, created by media and by the sort of interventions of a director, for example, in a film, where you would have this, media would create this visual experience that would sort of either help break down existing ways of seeing the world and make possible a new revolutionary kind of site, or sort of reveal the revolutionary nature of the Soviet present. So all around you may be under development and various forms of deprivation, but you can sort of, media would allow you to see the revolutionary potential within that otherwise quotidian reality. So this is sort of ideas from the early cinematic avant-garde gathered around New Vision. The second one was the concept of play that was very much out of the theatrical avant-garde. Again, however, they were very fluid and they all sort of knew each other. And that was also focused on sort of spontaneity and the desire to engage citizens in a sort of participatory mass spectacle. This is where this idea of play came out of, these early post-revolutionary mass spectacles involving proletarian actors, kind of mass crowds, 20,000 people performing in a play. The idea was for them, sort of through the experience of participation, to kind of create the new revolutionary future in a way that was only partly scripted, right? So that would allow kind of for the spontaneous expression of these masses, while at the same time having some kind of directorial control, since spontaneous expression of the masses might not lead you toward the revolution. So play is another concept that they drew on. And the third was this idea of sort of catching life unawares. This was particularly the idea of Gigio Vertov, the early Soviet director, of sort of showing life in this unscripted, difficult to sort of catching life by surprise is the idea. So you would take, it would be a documentary film where the director would be involved in kind of gathering and editing in such a way that this, again, this inner meaning of Soviet life would be exposed. And